Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hey guys. Yeah, so everything I was told about my country is apparently a lie. Even our most American food is English, apparently. So, preemptive like, hope everyone's doing well. My name's Connor, if you're new. Original link to the video from Tasting with History with Max Miller. Top of the description. Great intro. Let's go.
As apple pie, but we all know the phrase American as apple pie,
Yeah.
but really it should be as English as apple pie, because today I am making the first recorded recipe for an apple pie which actually comes from 14th century England. So thank you to Factor for sponsoring this video.
Thanks,
as we
Factor.
make a medieval apple pie, this time on Tasting History. Today's recipe comes from my favorite historic cookbook, The Form of Curry, meaning the proper method of cookery. And it comes from around the year 1390 and was compiled in England by the chief master cooks of King Richard II. So because the recipes were written for the king, you can be sure that a lot of the ingredients are pretty nice and wouldn't be things available to most people at the time. Also, because it was written in the royal kitchens, you can be sure that the instructions are somewhat vague, especially for to make tarts in apples. Take good apples and good spices and figs and raisins and pears, and when they are well brayed, colored with saffron well, and do it in a coffin, and it forth to bake well. So
How English spelling has changed is fascinating.
this recipe leaves a lot up to interpretation. First of all, it doesn't give you any quantities for the ingredients of any kind. It doesn't specify any of the spices except for saffron, and it just assumes that you know how to make a coffin. A coffin being a type of crust that you would either cook food in or simply store food in. So
Bread bowl.
why is it so vague? Well, the royal kitchens would have had dozens, if not hundreds of cooks working at any given time, and only the master cook knew all of the components of an entire meal. And they would often sit at the center of the kitchen, not doing any cooking of their own, but rather calling out orders to those who were doing the cooking. And on occasion, there would be a scribe nearby scribbling down some of what he said, and that is what the form of curry is. So it's kind of like writing.
Question, guys. Question. If the king really wanted his scribe to write down the recipe, then why wouldn't he just ask his main chef to sit with his scribe and then just write out the whole thing? You know, seems to be a little more efficient.
Down a recipe via a game of telephone where the person who's actually writing down the recipe isn't probably a cook at all and doesn't really know what they're doing. So it just leaves a lot up to interpretation, but the nice thing is anyone who actually made these dishes originally is dead, and so there's nobody around that can tell you that you've really done it the wrong way. So for my interpretation of this tart of
I'm
apples,
imagining like a
what you'll
medieval
need is
Gordon
3
Ramsay.
pounds or 1.3 kilograms of apples, a mix of sweet and tart, 1 pound or a half kilogram of pears, half a cup or 80 grams of raisins, and half a cup or 60 grams of chopped dried
Keep
figs.
the raisins.
Now those last two ingredients would have been pretty pricey at the time because they would have been imported either from France or around the Mediterranean. But the spices are actually what would have made this dish have a price through the roof. Now last, the only spice the recipe calls out by name is saffron, and that is the one spice that grew in England at the time. And for this recipe, 8 to 10 threads mixed with a little water will do. Frankly, it doesn't have a great effect on the color, and the taste is minimal, so you could probably leave it out if you wanted to.
Come on, it's the only thing written down. You gotta add it.
As for the other spices, you can't leave those out, but we don't really know what the spices were. But I would assume it is some sort of poudre douce, or sweet powders, which was a common spice mixture in the Middle Ages for things like this. Now, this spice mixture would change from kitchen to kitchen and cook to cook, but my version of poudre douce is going to be 2 tablespoons of sugar, 1.5 teaspoons of cinnamon, 1 teaspoon of ginger, a half teaspoon of nutmeg, a half teaspoon of cardamom, and 1/8 teaspoon of cloves. And yes, sugar was considered a spice. In fact, we just don't call it a spice because we use it in such large amounts. And if we called it a spice, then you would have to consider a Snickers bar a spicy food, which I guess technically it is. So start by chopping your apples and your pears. Of course, you should remove the core, but you don't really need to remove the skin because it's going to be cooked so much that it's not going to matter. Also, the skins will be barely recognizable once we mash these up. The recipe uses the word ibred, which essentially means ground, so you can mash them in a mortar or in a bowl with the end of a rolling pin like I did, or just put them in a food processor. It all ends up.
So I'm not a huge pie fan. I don't love dessert really at all. Sometimes I'll like dessert, but I did wonder where the filling in the apple pie came from. You had the obvious apple slices, and then you had this sort of filling. But is this just I wish I knew how to make modern apple pie so I could kind of
as a
compare.
mush of fruit. To this mush, you add the raisins and the chopped figs, as well as the saffron water. Mix that in, and then add in the mixture of sugar and the other spices. Again, you can remove any of these spices or add others like galangal or even black pepper if you want. What spices to use would have been up to the cook then, and it is up to you today. And after all, variety is the spice of life, which is why I really appreciate the variety of meals from today's sponsor, Factor, who have recently...
Guys, fast forward if you want, but I'm watching his video. If you do watch the ad with me and you're interested in Factor, just make sure to use his promo codes and links. Original link to his video, top of the description.
Doubled the size of their menu. Factor delivers chef-crafted meals straight to your door that you can enjoy in just minutes. For instance, for lunch, I can heat up a delicious meal like the sweet potato grits and sage chicken with honey roasted carrots and green beans. I've been eating Factor meals for the better part of a decade, long before I started tasting history, because they are delicious and well portioned, and portion control is always something I've struggled with, so Factor is a great solution for that. And I never get bored because they offer a rotating menu of over 80 weekly meals with options for every diet, whether you're going high protein, watching your calories, or trying to up your fiber intake. And right now, you can get 50% off by following my link in the description or heading to factor75.com and use my code TastingHistoryFB50. That is 50% off, plus you will get free breakfast for a year. That's free breakfast for a year, 50% off when you use my code TastingHistoryFB50 at the link in the description. And now, let us get back to that pie. So with the filling ready, it is time to make the crust. And there are lots of ways to make a medieval crust. Some were meant to be eaten. They would have eggs and even sugar or saffron in it. And then some were just meant to be a container and rarely were ever eaten at all. Today, I'm going to use a crust that is kind of in the middle. It's a hot water crust pastry. It is very edible, but it's also really sturdy, so we can get a nice standalone pie. So for this, what you'll need is 4 cups or 500 grams of flour, 1 teaspoon of salt, 1 cup or 235 milliliters of water, and 1 cup or 225 grams of suet or lard. So first, bring the water to a gentle boil on the stove, and then add in the fat and let it melt. You can also add in the salt right now, but if you forget, like I...
Guys, if you cut the fat off of an animal and you have just a slab of pure fat, is that suet, or does anyone know what is suet? Just another name for fat that you add in dishes?
You can add it later, it's not a big deal. Once the fat has melted and it is simmering, pour it into the flour and start to mix it all together. Here is where I remembered to add the salt. Eventually, it will all come together and be cool enough to handle with your hands. And you want to knead it for just a minute or so until it becomes nice and smooth, and then let it cool for just a couple minutes until it's still warm but cool enough that you can handle it. You don't want to let it cool too much because it does start to get hard to work with if you do. And you still want it warm when you divide it. You want one large piece, about 3/4 of the dough, and then a smaller piece, about 1/4 of the dough. Take the larger piece and press it into a mold. You can use a cake pan or a springform pan. The great thing, though, about hot water crust is that it is very forgiving. Unlike a normal pie crust, which is like a hot house flour, you can't do anything to it or else you'll screw it up. This is more like Play-Doh, and you can just mash it in, mold it however you want. Heck, if you have a crack, just take a little bit more and patch it up.
One of the problems I have with cooking is not knowing when something is going to stick to whatever I'm cooking something in. But since that dough is made with fat, I imagine it's not going to be a problem. And maybe it's a non-stick pan.
Just don't let it get too cold because it does become more and more prone to cracking as it cools. Then once you have the main part of the coffin made, you can add your apple filling and pack it down. Then roll out the second smaller piece of dough and set it on top of the filling, tuck it in and crimp the edges to seal the filling in. Then cut out a little hole on top or pierce it a few times to let the steam out. Then you can either bake it as is, or you can brush the top with a bit of egg to give it some nice color. In the Middle Ages, they would often even add saffron to make it more golden. Then set it in the oven to bake at 375 degrees Fahrenheit, 190 Celsius for 45 to 50 minutes or until it is bubbling on top. Now, while we're able to recreate many aspects of this medieval pie, there are some things we simply will never be able to, namely the fruit that is inside. Around the year 800.
That's another thing. I wonder when the first oven where you had an idea of the temperature, when was the thermometer invented? A cooking thermometer. Wikipedia. No, no. Oh, right here. 1714. Okay. Well, that's a lot later than this is, but still helpful. Crap, where was I?
800, the Emperor Charlemagne named the fruit that is inside. Around the year 800, the Emperor Charlemagne named a host of apple varieties that he wished to be grown on his lands. The names of apples are Gosmaringa, Geroldinga, Crevedella, Spirauca. There are sweet ones, bitter ones, those that keep well, those that are to be eaten straight away, and early ones. Alas, while we know the names of these and other medieval apple varieties, most of them are either extinct or they've changed so much that there's no reason to think that they are the same now as when this pie would have originally been made. But it's clear by Charlemagne's list of...
Have you guys seen what like an old banana looks like? I highly recommend. I'll just look it up. Old banana. No, I don't mean like a... No. Right here. And the seeds are huge. They're like marbles.
Apples, that fruit was very popular in medieval Europe. So while our pie bakes and you make sure you're subscribed to Tasting History, let's take a closer look at the medieval apple. During the Roman Empire, apples were one of the many fruits which were cultivated all across Europe and Britain. But as the empire crumbled, so too did the apple orchards. See, apples are unlike most fruits. If you take an apple seed and plant it, the resulting tree will likely not be the same as the apple that the seed came from. The size, the taste, the smell, the color, everything can be different from the original apple. So to get a copy of that original apple, it needs to be grafted onto an existing rootstock. This is something that takes patience and skill, and at least by some accounts, this patience and skill were not something that those people replacing the Roman legions had. In 6th century Britain, for example, a monk named Gil...
Is that the case with any other fruit or vegetable? That you so if you just planted the apple seed, it'll grow an apple that is just doesn't taste good?
Thus, Sapiens, or the Wise, wrote a work which translates to the conquest and ruin of Britain. And in it, he goes on a bit of a tirade about the fall of Britain and how things are changing around him, and everything is collapsing, including the fruit orchards, and he blames it on immigrants, the impious Saxons, a race hateful both to God and men. Nothing was ever so pernicious to our country, nothing ever so unlucky. He says these newcomers don't care at all about husbandry, so the crops of Britain have all gone to pot, including the apple trees. Now, Gildas was a bit of a curmudgeon and probably overstated the loss of all the apples in Britain at the time, because in subsequent centuries there is evidence for non-wild apples being in existence where he lived. But many of these apples were probably not cultivated by the new Saxon farmers, but by monks like himself. Much of the agricultural knowledge known to the Romans survived due to the monasteries of Europe, as they were often committed to growing most, if not all, of their own food, so they never had to leave the walls of their monasteries. And when they would establish new monasteries, they would often take that knowledge along with the actual tree grafts with them to spread different types of fruit around Europe. This led to a renewed expansion of different varieties of apples, and many of these apples stayed within the confines of monasteries for a long time, until around at least 800, when the new emperor Charlemagne set out the Capitulare de Villis, or rule of land use, which decreed that the royal lands around cities should be used to grow food, and not just grains, but fruits. As for trees, it is our wish that they shall have various kinds of apple, pear, plum, sorb, medlar, chestnut, and peach. Now, surely the rise of these fruits and medieval horticulture in general cannot all be traced to this one act, but it was definitely influential, especially in France. And so, when the French, specifically the Normans, ended up invading England and...
That is a cool thing about religious institutions, by the way. I'm not a religious person, but historically, religions can survive even through conquest. And so that you can still kind of keep traditions and know-how, knowledge within that church, even if it's kind of like the spine, even if the meat around it changes, the spine will... It's not a great analogy. I hope you get what I mean.
In 66, they are thought to have brought a number of apple varieties with them.
Norman
there
Conquest.
were the Pearmain, Pippin, Faro, and Renette. Some of these names actually still exist today, though it's unlikely that they are actually the same as their medieval ancestors. One of the most popular varieties at this time was something called the Pomme Costard. Oh. It was mentioned on a fruiterer's bill for King Edward I in 1292, and in 1296, 1 shilling could get you 100 costard apples in the city of Oxford. And while that may sound like a smacking good deal, you have to remember that the average laborer made just over 1 shilling each week at that time, so those are some pretty expensive apples. Now, one reason that these apples, the costard, was so popular was that it was not only good for eating, but also for drinking, turning into cider, which I will get back to. As for eating, many medieval and Renaissance authors agree that apples were good for you, though very often not when eaten raw. Around 1500, it was written that a cook should beware of green salads and raw fruits, for they will make your sovereign sick. And so cooking apples was the preferred way to...
I hear that lettuce causes more, I would think that most like sicknesses from food would be more meat-based, but apparently lettuce can cause more food poisoning than almost anything else. I'm not sure about more than anything else, but a surprisingly large amount of sickness from food comes from lettuce. That's what I'm saying.
Eat them, either stewed into an applesauce, or baked into fritters or pies, or roasted on the fire. They could also be dried. They would be sliced up and then strung on a string and left out in the sun to dry, and so they would last a lot longer after apple picking season. Though while most people did not prefer to eat them raw, there was one 12th century medical text that suggested it was good to eat them raw if you were backed up. When raw, they will the lower bowel move. When cooked, both food and useful physic prove. Bad are all apples, but the Appian kind, and ere you eat of them, pare off the rind. And 4 centuries later, the herbalist John Gerard confirmed this theory when he wrote, "They do not easily and speedily pass through the belly, and therefore they do mollify the belly, especially being taken before meat. Roasted apples are always better than the raw, the harm whereof is both mended by the fire, and may also be corrected by adding unto them seeds or spices. The apples in our pie are both mingled with spices and they're cooked, so we should be good to go." Now, he also suggests taking mashed apples and mixing them with lard and rose water, but not to eat, but rather to spread on your face if you have a bad complexion.
All right, this might be a little gross, so just fast forward or whatever. But you know, like sometimes dogs will eat grass, and it might be because their tummy hurts, their stomach is upset. And I'm thinking maybe like the fibrous nature and thin, long nature of grass might bind the contents of the stomach and the intestine into kind of a train of feces rather than a sludge. Could the apple eating raw be for the same purpose? Was that too weird?
Namely, if you have like scars. To spread on your face if you have a bad complexion. Namely, if you have like scars. He says it will take away the roughness of the skin. So good for eating and for rubbing on your skin and for drinking, because apples were very often used to make both cider and verjuice. And it wasn't just the delicious apples that you could use, but also sour crab apples. Verjuice, meaning green.
Crab apples, these things are like this big, you know, small, plum size, maybe smaller. And I remember eating them as a kid. You could find them on trees. And I wouldn't eat the whole thing, but they were so abundant sometimes on trees. And you could throw these things a mile because they're dense. And so we'd like throw them at each other. Stupid kid stuff. But they were extremely sour. I remember that.
Juice was essentially a vinegar made from apples, though it could also be made from grapes. It was used in a lot of cooking during the medieval period, but it was also used in medicine. When the plague first broke out in Paris in 1348, there was a treatise written on how to protect yourself from it should you be susceptible. The bodies most likely to take the stamp of this pestilence are those which are hot and moist,
Probably
for
true.
they are the most susceptible to putrefaction.
Hey, that seems just that seems like that would be true, but I'm no doctor.
Hot and moist don't actually mean that you are hot or moist, but rather those refer to aspects of the humoral theory, the theory that there were 4 liquids inside of you that basically controlled all aspects of health, and if you were hot and moist, that meant you had too much blood or you were sanguine, and so you could either have it let out via a hole in your vein, or much easier was to simply balance it with something that had the opposite properties, like verjuice. Obviously,
Traditional Chinese medicine is still a thing practiced in China, and when I learn about it, it sounds suspiciously familiar to that sort of stuff, like the 4 humors. Like it's like if you're having blood issues, eat a leech or rhino horn or brittle bones or something like that. I don't know.
Drinking the verjuice didn't actually cure you of the plague, but they did the best that they could. Now, more popular even than verjuice was cider. Alcohol was often made by fermenting apples or pears or really any fruit, and in rural settings was more often drunk than both wine or ale, as it was easy to make at home. During the month of September, it was traditional to gather up the crab apples on your property so that you could make cider. This activity was included in the 1573 work 500 Points of Good Husbandry, which says that in September you should geld bulls and rams, sow ponds, amend dams, sell Webster thy wool, fruit gather, grapes pull, for fear of drabs, go gather thy crabs. I had to look up 2 words in that. First was Webster, which turns out is not just the name of one of my favorite shows growing up in the 80s, but was an old term for weaver, and that makes sense why you're giving the weaver your wool. The other word was drab. Now, today it can mean, kind of plain and everything, but even back then it could also refer to just plain undyed wool. But that is not how it is being used here. Here, it means an unclean, promiscuous woman, very often a harlot. This is how Shakespeare typically uses the term, like in Macbeth when the witch's brew calls for the finger of birth-strangled babe, ditch delivered by a drab. But why, oh why, would crab apples ward off this type of drab? I'm not entirely sure, but I do have a theory to postulate. Should you end up visiting one of these types of drabs, a harlot, well, then John Gerard suggests that you might benefit from an apple. For the pulp of roasted apples mixed to a froth in water and drunk by the court has benefited those with gonorrhea. Again, I'm not entirely sure that that's the case, but it would make sense.
Somebody test that.
So, if ever you find yourself in that unfortunate situation, might I suggest you make this tart of apples from 14th century England. So should you wish, just before the pie is done, remove the outer collar from the springform pan if you're using.
I just know that if I did that, it would stick, and then this would pull up and that would sink and it would go everywhere.
And before the pie is done, remove the outer collar from the springform pan if you're using one, and brush some more egg around the sides to give it a uniform color. Then bake it for 5 more minutes, then take it out and let it cool completely before serving. And here we are, a 14th century recipe for tart of apples from the court of King Richard II. It held up so well. You know, the
looks like a chili.
Filling, it's densely packed, but it's not spilling out. It looks pretty good. So let's talk about this crust. So this was a coffin, and sometimes they were meant to be eaten, and sometimes they were not. They would not have been eating with this. They didn't really use forks in England at this time.
No, I don't know.
So they would have used either a spoon or their hands, and so often the top would have been lifted off, and then the inside would have been eaten out more like a pudding kind of thing. So that's how I'm going to do it, though I am going to try the inside. Obviously, it would have been the whole pie. We'll just take the top off. Here we go. That's really good. It's not too sweet. There's very little sugar in this. So you're getting all the sweetness of the apples and the pears and the dried fruits. And then the spices are really strong, but really pleasant.
You taste the saffron.
I mean, it has many aspects of a modern apple pie, but is also quite different. And I think whatever spices you use will really inform that. Like I said, you could use pepper in this or something like that, which would be very, very different from a modern apple pie and would absolutely work. I also really love the texture. It is more like a pudding of some sort, a compote. It's not too smooth, but it's smooth enough. There are just pieces of the dates and the raisins left. That was really good. As for the crust, the paste, break off a bit. So hot water crust is definitely firmer. It's not going to be as, crumbly as regular pie crust. The flavor is really good. The flavor is that of lard, so, delicious. If you use suet, that works as well.
I don't know the difference.
You can add sugar if you want. You don't have to. But really, as it is, it works really well. So today, hot water crust pastry is usually reserved for savory pies, like a pork pie or something like that. But it can be used for anything, and it just makes such a good holder, and that's what the coffin would have been at this time. Either way, delicious. You should make this. This is the apple pie to try for this fall, and let me know what you think. And I will see you next time on Tasting History.
Great video as always. Max Miller, Tasting History. It looked very different, for sure, and I'm sure it would taste a bit different. The main thing with apple pie is like you see a almost caramelly color filling with apple slices that you can see and recognize throughout the pie, right? This was much more, he had a word for it. Did he say like medley? But if you asked me what that was, I would say, and I knew nothing about it, I would say it's some sort of meat pie, right? But it's not, obviously. There's no meat in it. Looks amazing, fascinating for sure. Not an American thing. Disappointing. But it was really interesting to learn about this. So, love you all. Hope you're all doing well. Would appreciate any comments down below. And I hope to see you guys next time. We'll keep on learning together. Bye, guys.